on Research Institute, and Professor of Research Policy here at the University of Sheffield. And it's a real pleasure to welcome everybody to this, what will be the first in a new series of seminars that we're running through RoRI, and in association for this first event with the Sheffield Meta Science Network as well. A series that we've titled Culture Shift, to try and bring together some of the most exciting thinkers, practitioners, policy entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, who are at the forefront of thinking about pioneering, propelling culture shifts in and around research. This is a big priority, of course, for RoRI and all of its work. And we wanted to try and have a regular monthly conversation where we bring interesting people to talk to the growing global community of academics, funders, and others who are part of the Research on Research Institute. RoRI, I should add, has another big meeting next week, next Monday, which will be the launch of our formal second phase. We've come to the end of our pilot phase, which ran for a couple of years, and we're about to launch phase 2. So there is another event coming up on the heels of this one, which you can get details of from the Research on Research Institute website. But without further ado, let's focus on today's discussion, because that's what we're all here for. And we are really delighted that Juan Pablo Pardo-Guerra has joined us and is going to talk to us and give us a flavour, a preview of his forthcoming book, The Quantified Scholar, which I think will be formally published in September. Somebody's got their good, it's gone, microphone on there. Formally published in September. I first read the opening chapter, as I'm sure others here did too, when JP posted it online some months ago, and was really taken with it. I thought it was a fantastically novel and creative, rich mix of methods and perspectives looking at these issues. I mean, having worked on some of these questions myself, particularly in the context of UK research assessment, I was really excited by it. And so when I then had a chance to read the whole thing, I was even more excited, and we were really keen to get this event together to talk about it. At a narrow sort of particular level, it's very topical here in a UK context, because we've just come to the end of the thing that is the trigger at the beginning of JP's book for what follows, the Research Excellence Framework, this periodic assessment that we put ourselves through in the UK system for a range of reasons. So it means that these debates are very high on everyone's agenda. But of course, more broadly than that, the kind of perspective that the book contains, I think, is relevant in the context of research evaluation, assessment, and broader debates about disciplines, the future of disciplines, the way in which we organise and disorganise knowledge in every country around the world. So I'm going to shut up and hand over very shortly to JP, who's going to talk, I think, for about 35 minutes. We then have two discussants' perspectives we're going to hear from before we open up to questions. We're really pleased to be joined by, firstly, Professor Sarah Rijcke, who is Director of CWTS, the Centre for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University, and co-chair of RoRI, and a long-time collaborator with us on these and related issues. And secondly, Molly Morgan-Jones, who is the Director of Policy at the British Academy, the National Academy for Social Sciences and Humanities here in the UK. So two really great additional views, and then we will, I promise you, make plenty of time for discussion. Do make good use of the chat function, though. In the meantime, feel free to sort of keep the discussion going alongside, and we'll do our best then to come to real questions and discussion as soon as we've got through the main business. I'm going to hand over now with thanks again for joining us, and in eager anticipation of what he's going to say, to Juan Pablo Pardo-Guerra. JP.
Thank you so much for this incredibly kind invitation. It is truly a pleasure to be here. I do want to thank you, James, and also Sarah and Molly for their comments. So what I'll do is I will talk a little bit about the book, and I'll give an overview of the argument and what the book is trying to do with respect to the research excellence framework and in general, the way academics evaluate their work with specific consequences on the shape of the disciplines that they inhabit. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I do apologize for the delay. I was having some technical problems, as tends to happen with people who are sort of doing these things, Murphy's Law in a sense. But again, thank you so much for this opportunity. So just a context for where the project comes from. The project really is inspired by my experience as an academic at the London School of Economics a few years back. And one of the most striking moments in my 5 years at LSE was this day where we were brought together in a departmental meeting and had to come up with a list of the journals that we found relevant for our discipline that would be then used to evaluate our work and our productivity in the years to come. Now, what was interesting about this exercise is that it was a room full of sociologists who had read books, articles, and so forth on reactivity, on the roles of rankings in shaping organizations, on the politics of knowledge and similar topics. And nonetheless, there we were sitting in a room coming up with a cage that would then become the constraint of our academic lives. And that moment, that very interesting moment, was what inspired this. And of course, that moment occurred in the context of Ref 2014 and was an outcome of that evaluation. It was part of this necessity to find excellence, to define excellence in the work of academics, and to do so through a series of bureaucratic means. Interestingly, of course, these bureaucratic means were constructed actively by scholars themselves, who, in trying to control these evaluations, were in a sense accepting them begrudgingly and defining, in a sense, the limits of their own work by accepting how these evaluations work. And this is a theme that will continue across the talk today. So, of course, one of the things that inspires this is also the fact that metrics and forms of evaluation are absolutely everywhere. This experience of being evaluated is, of course, not unique to British academics. It is something we also observe throughout the world, from Australia to Mexico to Brazil, where citations, journal impact factors, H indices, et cetera, are tied to the way our worth is measured and our worth is determined within our sort of employment and within our organizations. And what the book is trying to do is make sense of how these metrics acquire power. How is it that they become these chains in our intellectual activity that constrain not only our individual lives, but more broadly, the direction of our disciplines. Of course, what I do is examine how these metrics are increasingly used and mobilized by both scholars and managers to reward and punish the work of academics. How they constitute, in a sense, the conditions of employment or the environments of employment in which we develop our intellectual work. And by creating all these constraints, define the shape of the disciplines that we co-construct and that we inhabit. And the question that this book tries to answer is, how or do these forms of quantification and ranking and evaluation affect, in a sense, the nature of scholarship, of the types of things we produce? There is, of course, lots of anecdotal evidence about this. We have heard from many colleagues and friends about how their research is modulated by these evaluations. But what this book tries to do is assemble different forms of evidence in order to answer this question, both with quantitative methods, but also with qualitative evidence. And what I do is I focus specifically on the case of Britain. And the case of Britain is important in a number of ways. The first is that, of course, I have familiarity, having been a member of academic staff in the United Kingdom. But it's also an interesting setting because it provides this quasi-experimental location because of the organizational similarity of universities across the United Kingdom. Even though universities in the UK were created, or new universities were introduced in the 1960s onwards, with the idea of catering to the interests and needs of very different audiences, over the last 50 years, they have converged in organizational design to very similar institutions. So this diversity that existed in the past has to some extent disappeared organizationally, and now most institutions are similar. So the effects of these evaluations are things we can sort of analyze in this quasi-experimental sense. There's also, of course, an important connection between these evaluations and the way in which they have been tied to scarcity and austerity in the sector. Of course, the research evaluation framework, as we know it, emerged out of the austerity measures of the 1980s, and it has continued over the last 36 years, 37 years, in part because of this imagined austerity and this self-imposed austerity on the higher education sector that has had consequences on how research is produced. And of course, the other interesting thing about the evaluations in the United Kingdom is that they're not about individuals. So unlike places like Mexico, for instance, which is another setting in which I have familiarity, where evaluations are individual and are targeted at specific scholars, what happens in the UK, of course, is that what gets evaluated are these units of assessments that stand as proxies of how the discipline is practiced in an institution. So they don't evaluate a philosopher at LSE, they evaluate philosophy at LSE. And that is an important characteristic that I exploit in this book. So what I do is I track the effects of the different waves of evaluation that have been rolled out in the United Kingdom since the 1980s, starting with the research selectivity exercise all the way to the research excellence framework, which is, of course, the most recent one. And I'm interested in these specific ways of evaluating the work of academics because of how they mix a variety of things. The first, of course, as I mentioned, is that they're disciplinary. The objective is not evaluating individuals, but evaluating disciplines as practiced in institutions. They're not entirely quantitative in the sense that they're not based on metrics such as citations and impact factors, but combine qualitative review in the form of peer review in panels of experts with quantitative scores that are the ultimate outcome of these qualitative evaluations. So this mixed character makes them interesting because they speak to some of the characteristics of scholarly work or scholarly evaluation, peer review, but at the same time, they end up with a quantified score. Theoretically, of course, they should be decoupled from personnel management decisions. They were introduced as a way of evaluating quality, not of managing personnel. But again, anecdotally, they have become increasingly sources or conditions or arguments for mobility of scholars within the UK's higher education sector. And these key characteristics allow us to investigate how they affect knowledge, but also academic careers as they have evolved over the last few decades. And I focus in particular on a very small subset of disciplines. I look in this book at the effects of these evaluations on social sciences. Why social sciences? Because they are much more flexible than other disciplines. Unlike, for example, unlike physics, for example, where you might have research tied to expensive equipment, and the social sciences are much more flexible in terms of how research gets done, where it is located, and it depends more on individuals than on teams, at least in these four disciplines, in economics, anthropology, politics, and sociology. And these allow us, or these characteristics allow us to think about the effects of these evaluations precisely on labor, on the mobility of scholars across institutional spaces. Why is this mobility interesting? Because as people move across institutions, they carry with them the knowledge that they produce, they change the conversations that they have, and of course, they transform slowly the structure and characteristic of their disciplines. So looking at how these evaluations affected the social sciences can be done by looking at how they affected the movement of scholars across institutions in the United Kingdom. Now, how is this done practically? I do this using something that I call an extended computational case method. This is inspired partly in the work of new sociologists who are producing exceptional research that uses computational methods, computational models to conduct essentially qualitative analysis of the world. But it's also inspired on the contributions of Burawoy, a sort of noted sociologist that produced or introduced this idea of the extended case method as a way of analyzing these large structural questions. And what I do in the book is I use statistical models based on the careers, or that look at the career structures of academics in the United Kingdom. These careers were inferred using about 142,000 papers in Web of Science that allowed us to identify about 16,000 academics across these 4 disciplines, to tie their movements across institutions to specific pieces of work, to look at data such as the citations that they had, et cetera, et cetera. And then this was all tied in with oral histories that I conducted with academics in the United Kingdom about their experiences in being evaluated. So what I do is I combine these different forms of data in order to produce a description or an analysis of how these evaluations affected both the career structures of academics, but also the everyday experiences in the workplace, which explain why they move across the institutional space the way they do. So let's look at the first element, which is exactly these career shifts as are observed in the UK, which are tied again to changes in the structure of disciplines. What I look at in order to explain this mobility of scholars across institutions are 3 measures that we can derive through these computational techniques from an analysis of the abstracts and publications of scholars over these multiple evaluations. The first measure that I use to try to make sense of mobility, in addition to measures that we usually throw into these models, such as gender, age, etc., is a measure of the similarity of their work to those of other scholars in the same institution. So we take their abstracts and we look at how similar the collection of all their abstracts over a period of evaluation is to those of their colleagues. A high level of relative similarity would mean that scholars are essentially repeating what others in their units of assessment are writing about. A low level would mean that they are very, very different. So this is the first measure we use to explain this mobility, these changing career structures in British academia. The other one has to do not with the individual, but with the department in which they work. And this has to do with the typicality of that department in the discipline. So using all these different elements of data from Web of Science, we take the departments across each period and we see how similar they are to each other, how typical they are within the field. A high level of typicality means that that department is very central, that it's very similar to other very similar departments that sit at the core of the discipline. A very low level of typicality means that that department does something that very few other departments are doing. It's very unique in some way. And then a third and very unique measure is this idea of categorical dissonance, which is essentially the notion of whether a scholar is being evaluated in the discipline in which they practice. So using data from various ref results and the inclusion of individuals in those different ways, we can see if, for example, an anthropologist was submitted to the panel in anthropology or not. If an anthropologist who publishes primarily in anthropology was submitted to, for example, management, that puts her in a situation of categorical dissonance because she is being evaluated by someone who is not in her discipline of practice. Does this affect the way they move through institutional space. So using all these different measures, we can show, and what the book does with these models is it shows that indeed over the last 3 decades, there's a very clear pattern of mobility in the United Kingdom, which we call epistemic sorting. What is this epistemic sorting all about? It's the movement of scholars from situations of less to more typicality. So scholars tend to move much more from departments that are very unique to those that are more common. That jump is much more likely. And also from situations of more similarity to those of less. They move to departments where their work is more unique with respect to that of their scholars. And what this graph is showing is exactly those probabilities of movement. And you can see that it's almost these concentric circles where the further you are from the center, from these situations of typicality and low similarity, the worse off you are in terms of mobility, the higher rates of mobility you will experience. Now, of course, what this implies is that over time, scholars are moving in very specific patterned ways. And this is changing, or this has changed historically, the composition of departments in such a way that they have become more and more similar. And it has cost us perhaps some important contributions and innovations in the field. One example that I think is very salient, of course, is the closure of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, which was one of these departments that had very sort of low levels of typicality, and that was closed because it didn't seem to fit with the discipline. Nonetheless, we know that that department, that center, that unit was fundamental for the development of the social sciences and humanities in the United Kingdom, and that it was the source of countless innovations that still speak to our discipline today. So one of the risks, of course, of this movement is that in these changes to the structure of disciplines, we lose these centers of uniqueness, these points of innovation. And indeed, if we look at how similar departments are, we see a clear trend towards decreasing similarity, decreasing diversity. In this graph, what you can see are changes in the diversity or the distance between departments across time. And you can see that sociology in the last ref in 2014 had the same levels of diversity as a field as economics did back in the 1980s, in the late 1980s. So we have been becoming more and more homogeneous as a field. And this largely has to do with these shifts, these pattern shifts in scholars moving across institutions. This is also something that we can see in how people write about concepts, using a series of techniques known as word embeddings that allow us to measure the similarity in the use of concepts within text. So you can look at how similar the words dog and cat are in a particular collection of texts. We can see if the use of particular concepts in each field has become more or less homogeneous, if there's more or less consensus around those concepts. And what we observe again with these computational models is that in 3 fields at least, economics, political science, and sociology, these concepts that scholars use have become much more homogeneous. So it's not only a matter of organizational diversity, it's not only the fact that the types of departments that we have across the sector have become more similar to each other, it is also the fact that the concepts, the way people think about the world has become much more homogeneous and similar. And this is, again, an effect of these movements, an effect of how there are pressures to conform to some disciplinary norm. So again, these statistical models, these computational models suggest that there is this decreasing organizational and conceptual diversity, which is associated perhaps to a lower risk, a lower sort of likelihood of innovation, of surprises, of serendipity, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one part, of course. We see these patterns of reduced diversity, but where does this come from? How is it that we as academics are co-participating in this transformation of the sector. Of course, the way research evaluations have been presented in many cases are as these external, these imposed projects on the academic world. But if we start looking at the organizational logics of these exercises, we find that actually a lot of the operation of research evaluations is maintained by how they reflect, they echo many of the cultures and forms of evaluation that scholars have in general, even without the evaluations. And these organizational logics are interesting. And they explain this motivation for scholars to shift the knowledge they produce, the careers that they have, and the tracks that they follow in the academic world. And we can find three sources or three explanations for why they do this. The first is that, of course, the evaluations are explicitly about disciplining scholars and disciplining scholars in a disciplinary direction. So we would expect these evaluations to have these disciplining effects because they are focused not on individuals, but on disciplines as how they're practiced in organizations. But why aren't these contested? That has to do with the fact that these evaluations echo the vocational logics, these Weberian vocational logics of academics, and as such aren't seen necessarily as these external impositions, but are part of the game that has to be played in order to have an academic life. So there's a co-participation, in a sense, of academics in these evaluations because of how they reflect these vocational logics. And of course, this is also something that gets bootstrapped into the way academics and their managers understand then what is excellent, the directions of their units, how things should be done in the future as both academics and public workers. So in order to see this, we can go into one example, which is again something that comes from the London School of Economics. One of the ways these evaluations shift the notions and the practices of disciplines is not through this external assessment at the level of the panels, but rather through internal evaluations that become important for the career of scholars. At the LSE, for example, we were given this sheet, a very simple device that was meant to be used as something to organize our submission to the REF. And one of the interesting things is that in this particular device, in this particular mock evaluation or mock assessment that was going to be conducted by the Department of Sociology, we had to specify how our work fit within the broader sociological discipline. We had to justify to our colleagues and to the administrators how our specific outputs were something that matched ideas of what it meant to be a sociologist. Again, there's nothing in the structure of the REF that imposes this obligation of mock assessments on institutions. This is largely a design or an innovation that institutions have introduced because it's a way of managing these evaluations. But in how they are practiced within departments, in how they are practiced on the ground, they end up forcing scholars or nudging scholars in a sense to think about their work in specifically disciplinary terms. Of course, this again is something that isn't untethered to our logics of work. It's something that actually reflects lots of our vocation, the way we are, in a sense, introduced into scholarship and into academia. This is something that came across in a conversation with Peter, a political scientist, who was talking about how the research evaluations affect or not his work. One of the interesting things about Peter, and indeed about most of the conversations I had with other scholars in the UK, is that many would say that the REF does not factor into the decisions they make about research. But actually, in a sense, when you push them a little bit and when you started talking about these mock assessments as instruments that they have to go through or as exercises that they have to go through in their own organizations, they would note that there are slight nudges or slight ways in which these evaluations have effects on their scholarship. In particular, one of the ways these evaluations work is they sort of invite scholars to try to target journals that are slightly more prestigious. They know that the work might not end up in those journals, but they nonetheless feel compelled to at least give it a try, to at least try to make an effort to submit those publications to these journals so that in the event of an acceptance, they would have something to show in the evaluation or in the mock assessment. And this changes the way they frame problems. They don't see it as something negative. They see it, again, as part of the conditions of their work, as part of what they should be doing. And this is something that slowly, again, changes the practices of the field towards the types of framings, the types of arguments, etc., that are more prominent in specific types of journals. It makes the gatekeepers and the communities associated to those journals more important to the discipline. So this is something, again, that came across in this conversation with Peter, where these targets are there and are real in terms of how they affect his scholarship. And then, of course, these targets and these forms of thinking about research evaluations, excellence, and the responsibility of scholars become these acceptable forms of management of colleagues and of employees. William, an anthropologist that I had a talk with, recalled this quite clearly when he was recalling a lot of the conversations he had as coordinator of REF at his institution. For him, it was clear that everyone understood the logics of the game, that everyone understood that they had to produce a certain type and a certain quantity of outputs for these evaluations, and that those who did not meet these standards of productivity had to have these awkward conversations around what they were doing in that particular institution. So for example, as a coordinator of REF in his institution, he had these difficult conversations with staff who hadn't published enough for the assessment. And these conversations were just excruciating. They're embarrassing because everyone kind of knew where they stood. Again, this idea that everyone knows where they stand gives you a sense of how pervasive these cultures of excellence tied to productivity are within these organizations. And of course, this is something that varies considerably across institutions. It's something that is tied not only to cultures within institutions, but also to the rankings or the standing of institutions across the sector, which creates very specific forms of homogeneity. The homogeneity that we observe is tied, it's tethered necessarily to these structures of status that we observe in the sector, because those structures are the ones that define what is excellence. Susan, a political scientist that I interviewed also for REF, talked about this in our conversation. The REF was something more important in a sort of less wealthy institution than the one she moved to, because it was something that was tied again to these ideas of status. And it was something that attracted more funding potentially and students. So being more competitive in these middle of the rank institutions was much more important in her everyday life than at an elite, wealthier university. So again, how these structures are organized is very much a reflection of the status hierarchies that we observe in the UK education sector. And indeed, what we see in the explanations from scholars is that there are multiple tensions driving this homogeneity in the sector that are actually less felt, less palpable in high prestige departments, in high prestige organizations, and in those that already have a level of internationalization that makes them sort of immune to the effects of the REF because they already do very internationally oriented and excellent research. So the forms of homogeneity, again, that we observe are just replicating much of this hierarchy that we observe in the higher education sector. So what are the consequences of this? Of course, one of the consequences is that it is producing these sort of echo chambers to some extent of knowledge. It's creating less diverse workplaces, environments, disciplines that are perhaps less adapted or less adaptive to the challenges of the future. In the social sciences, things are constantly changing. And at a time in sort of our history, when we are facing monumental challenges in terms of social, political, environmental strife, having different solutions becomes a very critical way of getting out of our current problems. The lack of diversity makes this problematic, of course. So how can we break with this effect of the research evaluations? The problem, in a sense, is not so much quantification as I
Hi, JP, can you hear us? I think you're having some connection problems. Oh. I think he has just temporarily dropped connection. This was the same problem he was having at the start. Hopefully he will be back any moment and we can resume. Sorry about this, folks. We'll just give him a second. Thanks to those who are starting to use the chat for discussion and questions.
It disconnected. Sorry.
Right, no, you're back. That's great. Yeah, we've probably got another 3 or 4 minutes anyway, Joe. But we'll move to.
But I'm almost so again. One of the things that I think might be important is trying to think about these practices of solidarity that we've seen in the sector around pensions, around conditions of work, et cetera, to try to use those types of practices to break with this vocation based on excellence, this vocation based on something that is not necessarily what should matter as much as it does, because again, what these evaluations are producing are these less diverse fields in a time of increasing austerity, increasing precarity of employment, and that this is, in a sense, a thing that we can change as academics because these vocations are ours.
Great, thanks, JP. That we'll draw. You're finished. I wasn't quite sure if you were ending it.
Yeah,
that is fantastic. No, thank you. Sorry for the IT troubles there at the end, but no, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And I've got about 25 questions, which I'm going to hold back because I want to hear from our respondents. But I mean, I think, for me, reading the book and hearing you talk it through here now, what is particularly rich in this is that you have, I think, really nailed in, or drilled into and surfaced what a lot of us sort of understand to be the case about the sort of effects of this exercise in ways that aren't formally attributable to the exercise. These sort of much deeper systemic effects in how we're organizing and thinking about sort of hierarchies of knowledge and ways in which disciplines and institutions organize themselves that are quite difficult to get into through formal analysis of the exercise itself. So I just think it's and points you're making there at the end about quantification. I mean, as you know, I've worked on the question of quantification in the ref, but I completely agree with that point, that it's of course, it isn't quantification per se, but you know, I think what you've done is really bring that out in a very rich and quite, you know, sort of unprecedentedly interesting way. It makes me want to ask you lots of questions about what we do beyond your point about solidarity, but I said I'm going to restrain myself, and I'm going to turn instead to Sarah de Rijcke to offer a few thoughts, sort of 5-6 minutes of thoughts in response, then to Molly, and then we will, I promise, go to wider questions. So Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, James. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yes, good. And in particular, thanks to JP for giving the academic community this wonderful gift by way of your extremely well-researched and also thorough book. I think it stands out for a number of reasons, and I'll start with praise, very lengthy praise, but I also have some comments to feed the discussion. I think it stands out because of the literatures you bring in, which really range from sociology of science to STS to anthropology, history and philosophy of science. But not only that, I think it also stands out because of the way you combine different methodologies from longitudinal data to statistical and computational models and the interviews, and how you integrate those findings from the empirical materials in a very innovative way, not only really enriching our understanding of the interactions between evaluation and quantification on the one hand and the substance of the scholarly work on the other. So that's really great. But I also wanted to point out an element of the book that I also loved, and that is how you bring in your own lived experience and make these experiences analytically relevant. So by making explicit how they informed your projects and also the questions and the concerns. And paradoxically, maybe this is something that happens quite rarely. That might maybe have something to do with the ways in which power and prestige are actually distributed in academia, that we don't acknowledge those lived experiences, or how more positivist philosophies of science have also engulfed our thinking about scientific objectivity. So I really like how you did that. And you also use, I think, those experiences and your history to not only inform the analyses, but also write a call to action on the basis of those experiences and the findings. And it's not just a call for action, it's, as you rightly point out, a moral call to action to the academic community to, in simple terms, push back on quantification in the academic workplace and practice more reflexive solidarity and use the power we actually have to stop reproducing inequalities and precarities in institutions the way we do sometimes by unreflexively adopting performance criteria and evaluation standards. So I really like that. But as a respondent, I also take my job to be to raise some points that we can maybe exchange views on in the discussion and that everyone else can also feed into. So I have 3 points. One is about the role of the social sciences themselves in the quantification of academia, which I think you mentioned, but also perhaps underplay a bit. And the second point is about your interview material, which gives great texture to the computational and statistical analyses, but I also wondered if they also, in a sense, did you a little bit of a disservice sometime. And the third point, if we come to that within the time I have, is about 2 trends in research evaluation, 2 quite opposite trends in research evaluation that I think your next book should be about. So the first is about the underplaying of the role of the social sciences in quantification of academia. So here I, of course, play a home game in a sense because of the fact that you do indeed mention the bibliometrics and scientometrics community and how the use of bibliometrics and scientometrics shifted from being concerned with the structure of scientific disciplines to also now being frequently used to determine the worth of scholarly contributions to those disciplines, which is, I think, right. And it's an active element of being a regulatory social science in the sense that much of the bibliometrics and scientometrics inform policy instruments like assessment, but also these instruments are shaped by regulatory processes. So I think because you cite a lot of sources, you're quite aware of the fact that social scientists produced the first university rankings 1.5 centuries ago. And it's also the social science of bibliometrics and scientometrics that help quantify academia. So I guess that to me would imply that it's also social science that should step up a bit more, maybe even more than that reflexive solidarity. So I'll return to that point in the end. But I first wanted to maybe raise this point about your interview material and especially the work it does for you in the later chapters of the book. And that had to do with the fact that, well, considering what we know about the real world effects of evaluation on knowledge production, that your book, again, in a very innovative ways demonstrates, I find it very fascinating that an overwhelming majority of your interviewees do not see or do not want to see how the REF or evaluation influences their practices and interests, their epistemic trajectories, and only in tangential conversations saw that connection by way of organizational responses to these assessment practices, for instance, in the hiring and promotion practices. I guess the trigger was that you are quite aware, obviously, also of the existing research that shows these performative effects of evaluation systems on the shop floor, and that they are perhaps even more invasive or consequential than you can now acknowledge when looking at your interview material. So that got me thinking, so on the one hand, your findings from the interviews are informative and they do the job of delivering this new information about your interviewees saying, well, this doesn't really affect us, or maybe it does. Is there maybe more to what they are saying, willing to say or can say because they're really unaware? Are these socially desirable answers, or are they really telling of how scholars identify with being independent or having academic freedom? Or should we really worry about the fact that they don't realize the interactions between these assessments and knowledge production? So I was really curious how you thought about those responses and how the conversations you had with them perhaps also led to them thinking about these things in a deeper way. And that has, so the third part, and then I'll wrap up, to do with the third part of my comment. I'd like to pick your brain about something. So I don't know if you would agree with me, but I think when we look at the current research evaluation landscape more globally, so zooming also out from the UK context, there are at least two trends. And one is actually a push back on quantification. So literally experimenting with ditching quantification in assessments. So in a sense, I think we're witnessing a movement that I think you leave untouched and perhaps even hold for impossible or unfeasible in your book. And the second trend is the total opposite, an intensification of the presence of quantitative information about research in the evaluation system, an increasing role for data analytics and for commercial data providers, making use of, I guess, ironically, the same type of computational methods that you are also using in your research. So I'm bringing this up also because of your beautiful call for solidarity toward the end of your book, which I wholeheartedly agree with. And also it's a guiding force for me personally in my role as director. But part of me thinks that we should go even a bit further in the sense that we shouldn't take quantification as something that we can't change and have no agency over, as I think you may be sometimes implying. And also because I think we should do more because we are partly, as social scientists, responsible for these trends. And the research intelligence part, I worry really that individual researchers, based also on what you have in your material, might not notice how data analytics are already shaping to a large extent what can be made to count in assessments. And this will increasingly also insert itself in the ranking and rating practices of the REF. So I very much agree that we really need to rethink our vocation, as you put it so beautifully, and practice solidarity. But I also think we're facing entirely different beasts as well. And so for me, the focus of your next book should be very clear right now. So to study these new emerging trends. I look forward to that, because this was a really brilliant book. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you, Sarah. That's fantastic. Some great points there. JP, if it's okay, I'm going to suggest we hear from Molly and then come back to you for a sort of agglomerated response to Sarah and Molly, and then we'll bring in as many comments, questions from colleagues as we can. With that in mind, can I encourage people to, as I say, to just sort of shove questions in the chat, because that makes it more likely that we'll flag them and be able to come to you in a few minutes. But let's just go now, though, to Molly Morgan-Jones from the British Academy. Molly.
Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks, James, and thanks, JP, for such a great presentation and book. I really enjoyed reading the book, and it was even kind of better to hear it come to life through your talk. Yeah, so as James said, I'm Molly. I'm the Director of Policy at the British Academy, and with the UK's National Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences. So it's a particular pleasure to both think about this book in relation to its implications for the social sciences, but also as a funder and a supporter and sort of the national voice for those disciplines, what we may need to think about, take on board, and kind of feedback through, and what leadership is required from all sorts of actors. I'll come back to that at the end. I just kind of wanted to make kind of 3 points. They're all interconnected. I mean, first, like Sarah and James, I really appreciate, the book, the mix of methods you've brought to it. It was just really wonderful, and I really appreciated the central lesson of this book. Perhaps one of, I think you've got a sort of sentence that says the central lesson is this, which I'll quote back in a minute, which is that it's not that quantification is bad and that it's mixed, and that's kind of really my view. I don't want to disagree with the effects quantification has had, and I don't want to agree that it's all bad, and I think that's kind of what you said, and at one point in the book it says it's when quantification becomes part of our way of making sense of the value of others and their knowledge, and then it leads to less hospitable less dynamic and less interdisciplinary fields, that it does become problematic, and I really kind of wholeheartedly agree with that point. And I think coming into it, I was a bit worried the book was going to be all about sort of bashing the sort of trend towards quantification, and I appreciated the sort of nuance and care you took towards not doing that, but pointing out the pitfalls and opportunities and challenges. And so that takes me to kind of the second point, is that I wondered throughout, I kept coming back to it to work, perhaps unashamedly or shamedly that I've done in the past when I've thought about these issues, is that do we need to do a lot more collective thinking about purpose when we think about assessment? And why are we using these different methods, and why the push towards quantification? And there's been a lot of work on this, particularly a lot more of the years, and RoRI's leading the way on a lot of this. And I've particularly looked at this when you think about assessing the impact of research. There's a whole range of other ways that you can quantify and think about research. And I guess one of the ways that I keep coming back to is thinking about kind of why are we doing this? Why are we assessing research? There's different kind of ways of thinking about this in some of the literature. Like I said, I've come back to over the years, are we doing it for advocacy? Are we trying to kind of make the case for research collectively as a community or for ourselves? And then what methods and metrics and techniques might we do to do that? Are we doing it for accountability reasons, good governance, talking to boards or, trustees, taxpayers, government about, why we fund these activities and why it's important? Are we doing it for analysis to kind of get under the skin of what's working, what's not? Obviously, that's, it's some of the area, well, a lot of the area that RoRI itself sits in, and kind of how we know what works. And then that informs decisions about how we both foster what we think is working and supporting the disciplines, but also maybe perhaps create spaces for things that you said, like serendipity and others to come through. And then allocation, which is obviously a big part of the ref and the way that you've thought about some of these things. So I guess I just kept coming back to that. So it's just kind of food for thought, and there might be a range of other ways of thinking about it, but might that be one way, thinking about the purpose of why we're doing it, to think creatively about how we can kind of lean into this solidarity point that you end on, and what are the creative approaches to both speak to, as Sarah says, the trend that we're already seeing, but see if we can help think it through and using a lens of kind of purpose to do that. And I guess related to that, as many of us know who work with indicators, really making sure that we're not looking to just any one single set of indicator, one single indicator or even set of indicators, and looking at them in isolation, because then we can massively distort, the bigger picture. Classic examples might be sort of counting patents or sorts of income levels without seeing them in the context of a wider sector or a wider field, or in relation to other things that are going on. And then finally, my third point, and it's not really a critique, but a few of the things I kind of wondered about, and I don't think were covered, but might be in relation to future work. Sorry, just 1 second. Is thinking about kind of the students and the teaching. So again, I wondered, you had in one of your slides a kind of list at the beginning of the whole range of different ways that sort of metrics are used. Again, thinking about the interplay between teaching, research, students, and all of those coming together might be another way that you come to kind of the next iteration of the book. And so I guess to conclude, like Sarah has said, why should we care? I think, the counterfactual is really important. You gave us the example of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. How do we really get under the skin of that unknown? And it feels intuitive that we have to allow for structures and research that allow for experimentation, innovation, new modes of knowledge to kind of emerge. But it's worth asking, when is, as you've termed it, epistemic sorting good? When is it bad? How do we get, how do we come to understand that? And then what are the roles that other actors and institutions in the system need to play? How do we respond? And again, to take your point about solidarity, how do we collectively come together to do that? So those are my thoughts, but thanks very much for the opportunity to respond.
Brilliant, thanks Molly, very much. That's great. Again, some really helpful questions and thoughts for JP to respond to. JP, I hand over to you to sort of, as I say, give some thoughts. There's a lot there to respond to, so feel free to sort of weave between the various points you heard there from Sarah and Molly, and then, as I say, we'll go to wider questions. But yeah, over to you.
Thank you very much. These are amazing comments. These are incredibly generous, and I think that the critiques do make complete sense. So thank you very much for reading the book and engaging with it, with these wonderful questions and discussions. So I think that indeed I'll start with the issue of the social sciences and how they might be an example of what is wrong and what can be changed. I think that the fact that the sort of rankings and ideas of evaluating quality came or were supported in many ways by certain parts of the social sciences is particularly clear today in terms of one social science that is incredibly comfortable with the ref, which is economics. So the social sciences are central in this, not only because they created lots of the sort of instruments that gave origin to these ideas of measuring quality in academia, but also today because one of them, at least, economics, provides a way of thinking about problems and public problems that justifies also these forms of evaluation in terms of quality of research that has to be internationally competitive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that further reproduces the high-level institutional power of these evaluations. And that's where the other social sciences really have a lot of work to do about what is the purpose, not only of these evaluations, but of themselves as scientists, as scholars working in public institutions. One of the questions that I think has emerged out of these 2 years of pandemic, for example, is this sort of more detailed rethinking of the work of an academic. Are we here to just publish papers and teach, or is our role something that should transcend the classroom in some way or another, that should go beyond sort of peer-reviewed publications that depend, again, on all these forms of evaluation that might be reproducing a lot of these work environments that we don't want to have necessarily. And this is a good moment to think about exactly what types of professions, what types of disciplines we might want to inhabit. And that might imply, in this rethinking of purpose, that might imply not necessarily opposing quantification per se, or modes of evaluations that we've seen today, but using them in slightly different ways. So for example, these opposite trends that Sarah mentions are very interesting, because I think that what is fascinating in these opposite trends is what gets quantified and what doesn't get quantified. What are the activities that we put value on, and which ones are the ones that we completely ignore? In sort of promotions of academic staff, for example, we still, of course, place a ton of emphasis on research, because that is what we see as the role of the modern academic, to produce research. If you want to go up for promotion at LSE, or if you're going through a merit review at LSE, you need to demonstrate research in certain types of places. It doesn't matter if you are the best teacher in the universe. It doesn't matter if you've been working on every single committee to make the life of your colleagues better. What matters at the end of the day is research. And a lot of the work, both in dequantification and in quantification, really goes into looking at new ways to measure or not measure research and research productivity. And that's just one aspect in the life of academics. At the end of the day, we inhabit 3 different roles in our institutions. And we tend to ignore at least one of those roles quite a bit. The other one we use strategically now and then, which is teaching. But the one that we really focus on is research. That's also reflected in how scholars are trained throughout grad school. It's also something that reflects the imaginaries that they have when they finish their PhDs. Going into a teaching position is seen as being a lesser scholar than going into a research position. And all of those things have to do with these cultures of not only what is the purpose of evaluations, but what is the purpose of us as academics? And what are we trying to build? So for example, these small forms, like the ones that exist in departments like the LSE, where you have to explain how your research matches or not the canons of the discipline, are entirely under our control. They're not things that are controlled by the sort of next step in management, and are things that we could reimagine in significant ways. The discussion that opens the book of a room full of sociologists thinking about what is excellent in sociology in terms of journals is again something that could have happened in a very different way. We could have decided everything is excellent or nothing is excellent. We could have walked out and said, let's go grab a coffee and discuss this on a case-by-case basis, or we could have just included every single index journal that exists in the Web of Science. So there are these decision points where I think we need to think about exactly what matters for us as academics, not only in our own personal lives, but also in the lives of those that we are training as PhD students, those that we are recruiting into the future, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that a lot of the sort of work on solidarity really goes into that. And this sort of issue that also Sarah mentioned about the interviews highlights perhaps one of the reasons why solidarity is so difficult. The fact that scholars didn't recognize REF explicitly as something that is affecting the way they work. I think from my sense of the interviews and my sense of also having been in the UK is that there's a certain antipathy to saying that you are not autonomous as a scholar, that you are somehow constrained by forces beyond your control. The way we have imagined academia is in a very individualistic way of producing things. Even though we end up being evaluated by our institutions, we do still imagine the individual as the one that is responsible for producing knowledge. And this is even amongst social scientists who don't necessarily reflect about where they're located as something that is allowing them to produce certain types of work or not. So I think that the reason why people didn't talk about REF and why they didn't necessarily reflect more about their conditions is because we do hold this autonomy, this sort of individual freedom in academia as something that is absolutely paramount. And that to some extent makes us ignore the effects of some of these structures of evaluation. And that also goes into teaching, that also goes into how our other sort of aspects of the academic career are evaluated. We tend to ignore, in a sense, those things as being the products of our context. And this is insane because it's even something that happens among, again, anthropologists and sociologists, who one would think are more aware of the fact that knowledge is collectively built. So I think that is really, there's a question I think in the chat that had to do with that, which is these vocational affinities. I think that as a profession, we are trained to think in very specific ways that value certain types of work more than others. That is where we focus our work on quantification or dequantification. That is where we focus our work on evaluation. That is where we center our worth, in a sense. And those vocations that are about producing knowledge for the sake of knowledge, this idea of the sort of lonely academic that Weber conjured almost 100 years ago, if not 100 years ago, is in a sense what is disguising the fact that a lot of what we do is collective, and that the only way we can build sustainable disciplines and hospitable disciplines is by recognizing that we depend on the work of others. And that also implies having work that might not seem disciplinary within our fields, because that might be the source of the next innovation, in a sense.
JP, thanks. That's really helpful. I just wanted to picking up more of the questions in the chat, and I should say to people, feel free as well to put your hand up and just ask a question in with the video, and then all way everyone free to chip in at this point. But just on that last point, I mean, you touched the vocational affinities question, but there are a couple of other questions in the chat about that I think riff off what you've just been saying. So people asking the extent to which you've looked at other countries which haven't changed their assessment tools. I mean, obviously, the book isn't trying to do that in a systematic way, but you obviously got experience with the Mexican system, you obviously now in the US system, etc. And a similar, I mean, Philip Kern down the bottom has asked about China specifically as a it's always quite contrasting system, but one which is also grappling with, of course, with these questions in a different way. I suppose it's all of this sort of points to as you're starting to then your answer, how much of this is really to do with the ref and how much is to do with, I mean, in the UK context, the ref has become the thing through which we navigate, negotiate, arbitrate, argue, and construct these things. They're done in different ways in other systems, but they're done obviously in all systems. And so while of course there is an industry of people wailing and gnashing their teeth specifically here about the ref, well, which is legitimate, and I'm part of it, I guess. In a sense that the problems are far bigger or more systemic and more cross system. So yeah, sorry, I'm reinterpreting the questions as it were and bringing them together, but sort of thoughts on any of that would be great.
I mean, I think that that of course this isn't something limited to the UK, and originally actually the project was going to be comparative, but then I sort of encountered the problems of comparison because there are so many moving parts in the higher education system that actually doing a comparison between, for example, Brazil, Mexico, and the UK, which was one of the original ideas, would be incredibly difficult because of the structures of the disciplines, the careers of academics, et cetera, et cetera. And I do think, however, that this is a global issue, in part because this, and I mean, one of the ways of thinking about that is that the very target of ref, which is also the target of a lot of these evaluation exercises and metrics, is this idea of internationalization of a global science that is the standard that we hold for evaluating quality, when that global science is largely constructed out of a handful of institutions and countries that do not actually represent the way knowledge is produced throughout the world. So there is to some extent a problem in how we imagine these standards globally, or how we imagine this global this goalpost in every single country, from China to Mexico to Brazil, and how that then becomes a target of our research. Now, this isn't something that happens as dramatically in other places. So I can give you examples of Brazil and Mexico, where the internationalness of an output is not necessarily the first way or the primary way in which its quality is evaluated. So a ref in Brazil would look very different to what happens in the UK. The fact that things were pegged to this international standard might perhaps be explaining why there is so much homogeneity, or why there is increasing homogeneity in the sector, because at the end of the day, this international is actually quite narrow in its composition. If we went to Brazil, where there's much more flexibility around where to publish, what is quality, et cetera, they accept local journals as being high quality journals because they speak to the practices of local social scientists, et cetera, the dynamics would be much more different, and we would perhaps not see the same pattern. So I think that one of the things when we're thinking about the pressures to quantify at a global scale or the pressures to quantify and measure excellence across countries, is to also understand how those countries have navigated, or how those different communities have navigated this issue of the goalposts, and those goalposts in relation to this idea of the global or internationally excellent research. And we would see that there's a lot of variation there that would also allow us to think about forms of solidarity. Maybe part of that solidarity is saying, you don't have to publish in the American Political Science Review. Don't even try that, because we won't give it additional points because it's international.
Great, thanks. That's great. I want to give time for some other questions to come in. Sean Muller is there, and I think David Shanks as well. So can we maybe just take both of you back to back and then come back to JP for responses? Sean first.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks for a fascinating presentation. I haven't had an opportunity to read the book, but I'm really looking forward to doing so. I just had a quick question, which I did also put in the chat, to summarize it very briefly. In your quantitative analysis, primarily, how do you deal with the issue of essentially selection into and out of the academy? So you talk about career transitions across institutions and also across ref categories, which I think is really interesting. But how do you deal with the fact that people exit the system because of these kinds of incentives, and that the people who enter the system might also be the types of people who perhaps are more willing to accommodate themselves to these kinds of dynamics? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question, Sean. Thank you. David, we'll take yours as well.
Yes, thank you, JP. And likewise, I look forward to reading the book. I wonder if there isn't a different way of thinking about research evaluation and the ref in particular that isn't quite so negative about its influence on behavior. And this came up with a couple of your examples. Like, one in particular just emphasizes this. You talked about somebody you interviewed who'd been thinking much more, prompted by the ref, about prestigious journals and sending his work to prestigious journals. And my thought when I sort of read that anecdote was, well, I was a head of department for 20 years. If I thought that an early career lecturer in my department wasn't thinking about sending her or his best work to the most prestigious journal, I would want to know why not. I mean, that's just part of what it is to be an academic and have an influence in one's work. So I wonder whether the ref isn't actually just, I mean, it's a lens. It's a lens for looking slightly more sharply at things that are already there. It doesn't invent new, incentives. I don't think Crick and Watson sent their paper to Nature because of its impact factor. I think they did that because they knew that that was the most effective way to communicate with their audience.
Great, thank you, David. JP, response to either, both of those.
So first to David, I think I completely agree. So I think that's also because that's how we're trained. We are trained in academia to aim for the top journals because that's where we see value. From how we are introduced to literature in classes to how we talk about the work of others at conferences, et cetera, et cetera. It's, I think, very natural to some extent within this vocation of the academic to try to get to the very top of the field. And that's fine. And the ref, of course, provides an incentive for that. The problem is that the top of the field in not a small number, but in various disciplines tends to be defined by journals like the American Political Science Review that are not under the control of the sort of local community, and that might not reflect the interests and the needs of particular national disciplinary groups. So if we look at the American Political Science Review, the number of papers by British authors in the last 20 years is negligible if we compare it to the number of American authors in the same journal. And the sort of concerns that those different communities are talking about are very different. And of course, there will be a bias towards certain types of topics in those journals because of who publishes there, who sits on the editorial board, et cetera, et cetera. This is also something that happens quite a lot in sociology, where, for example, it's a common trope in the US that when you're talking or writing about a non-US topic, you always have to justify why a study of Spain makes sense for an American journal, but you don't need to justify why a study of a small town in Kansas serves as something that you could publish in that journal. That's accepted as being legitimate, incontestable contribution. So I think it is true that the ref just serves as a lens, but maybe it's not the best lens that we could have. So I think to the question of not seeing where quantification comes into when we're talking about journal prestige, I think that what happens is that because the ref is built again on these disciplinary structures or on these disciplinary cultures, what it does is it ends up just amplifying them and making them more powerful on the ground through, for example, the mock assessments that happen in departments. So it just makes disciplines harder and creates more pressures to conform to a particular form of the discipline that, again, might not be the only one we could have. There could be more diversity than what we see today. One of the other examples, of course, is how book publishing has changed across the last 30 years. And this is also something that was mentioned by a few interviewees, that the incentives for writing a monograph have gone down considerably throughout their careers because a monograph, at least in the last iterations of the ref, was not seen as an effective way of generating outputs as publishing papers. And you have very different conversations in monographs than what you do in papers. And I think that also changes the way disciplines work. If we think of classics in the discipline, they tend to be books. And those classics are now moving into articles, which implies, again, a different way of thinking about what knowledge is. So that is something that I think is there with these evaluation systems. And Sean, I think that one of the things that was really difficult in generating the data was exactly trying to disambiguate who stayed and who didn't stay in academia. And that was months and months and months of work. And we ended up deciding that we would stick only with careers that were uninterrupted and where we would have only details on academic positions throughout those careers. So this study doesn't look at people exiting academia. We had some early information on the attrition in the sector and how that changed across waves of ref. but that was very noisy because it was difficult to determine where people were leaving for. And we didn't know why they were leaving, so it was somewhat complicated to include that in the analysis. But that would be another interesting follow-up to this study, which is looking at how it made perhaps careers more unstable and it increased levels of attrition in the sector. Another thing that would have been amazing is, of course, having salary data, which would have made the arguments of mobility much stronger in terms of their effects on income of individual academics, and these discussions about markets associated to REF emerging in the UK labor, higher education labor sector. So that would have been terrific, but again, that information is not available, at least not if you're working outside of the UK.
Great, thanks, JP. That's great. I was just putting a couple of things in the chat there. We're nearing the end of our time. I didn't want to miss one last question from the mix, which echoes a point that Sarah made, in which you've already sort of answered partly, but it would be good, I think, to maybe end on this note, and also perhaps to bring Sarah back in as well for a minute as well. Tim Winsler asks whether you could expand a bit on how you would institutionally undergird the call at the end of the book for increased solidarity among colleagues. So, I mean, Sarah raised, you know, one sort of direction to move in, as it were, in terms of agendas about, you know, sort of progressive reform agendas within processes of evaluation in research. Tim here is raising obviously more, you know, in some ways more conventional, but also vital aspects of this in terms of trades unions, interdepartmental regulations, etc. Just sort of get you to just sort of say a bit more about, and I guess sort of linked to that and linked to Sarah's point, as to how sort of optimistic, pessimistic, or sort of ambivalent you feel about the prospects of moves in those kinds of directions, given the many obvious countervailing headwinds.
So I think that there are many ways in which we can build these forms of solidarity. One is, for example, by having directors that, as Sarah mentioned, are very aware of these problems in their positions as directors. So I'm delighted to hear that Sarah is, of course, very aware of this as someone who is serving as director of a center. And I think that is, for example, something that matters, having awareness of how evaluations shape not only the conditions of work of individuals, but at the end of the day, our disciplines. But there's, of course, a lot of other sort of points of intervention. One is through organized labor organizations. So that's, of course, something that matters, even though I peg more of my faith, in a sense, on the work of academics every day than on the work of their unions, just because I think that what is motivating a lot of this is, again, the everyday dispositions and ideas of our profession that get channeled through how we evaluate colleagues, not only in these formal settings, but also in reviews of their work as part of promotions, in sort of conversations about where they published their latest article, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the cultures that I think can change, and that I think this moment sort of is very fitted for changing those conversations and cultures. So why am I optimistic that we might change those everyday cultures of academics, that we might think of our vocations in a slightly different way? Part of it has to do with the fact that we're all exhausted, for instance. So it's a good moment to rethink how our work is organized. Discussions about the difficulty of finding reviewers for journals is an indicator, or are indicators of these pressures that we do not take into account, and that maybe we should start counting. Maybe they should be part of the evaluation of our peers. Also discussions about achievement relative to opportunity, which have increased throughout the pandemic as something that can target or can make us rethink how we assign worth to our colleagues, so that we don't assume that everyone is working under the same conditions, but that we take into account the different conditions, backgrounds, and etc. that they face in real life when we're evaluating their productivity. And these things, or these nuggets of discussions that are happening right now across a number of institutions, are examples of how we might be able to rethink these vocations to create an academia that is more solidary. And the interesting thing is that a lot of this happens, or a lot of the realization of these things happens, when you become a participant of a lot of the bureaucratic structures of our institutions, and see these problems of evaluation, and see the possibilities for changing the instruments, the cultures, and the logics through which we assign worth to our immediate colleagues. And then what happens at the broader scale, that is more difficult. That is where, for example, the work of unions and the work of scientific organizations would be important. But again, I think that it's this everyday work of rethinking how we assign value to each other that really, really matters.
Thanks. That's a good note to end on from you, JP. I just wanted to bring Sarah back in for a minute, and then we will wrap up. Sarah, your reflections on JP's reflections, as it were.
Excellent set of reflections, and I hope everyone will read the book. Maybe in a future meeting we can push you a little bit on this point about responsible evaluation moves, trying to actually de-quantify, because I still think in your responses you leave that relatively untouched. But that's okay. We can save that for the next time. And thank you so much for this contribution.
Thank you.
Yes, I just put in the chat a link. I mean, we did Sarah and I co-authored with several others, a sort of an overview, I guess, of some of these sorts of initiatives. I mean, I think, there is, though, a very well substantiated critique of all of this stuff, that the stuff that we spend a lot of our time trying to do, that it's insufficient in terms of the scale of the challenges it's trying to address, which I'm very alive to. Nonetheless, we remain dedicated to trying, whether it's futile or not, to try and do things. But thank you. I mean, books like yours really are grist to that mill, and also just great, rich intellectual stimulation to this whole project and other related projects. I mean, as I think Molly alluded when she began her comments, at first reading the title of the book, I thought, you think, this is going to be one of those books that, hammers metrics over 180 pages. And it was a real joy to, as I say, read that first chapter initially online and realize just quite what you were doing, and how rich, sophisticated, and sort of, original the mix of perspectives you're bringing to bear on all of this, which Sarah has far more eloquently than me already described. So we're very grateful to you for coming and sharing that with us. The book is going to be available in September. Is that still the case?
I think that's the case, yeah.
Pre-order it now on your book ordering platform of choice, or at your local bookshop. I'm sure we'll be wanting to hear more from you on it. In the UK ref context, there's lots one could sort of draw from what you've done to bring into that. But I think I said to you in an email the other day, you sort of be careful what you wish for in terms of getting yourself drawn into that particular circus, and being safely now ensconced in California, you might be wise to judiciously re-enter the particularities of the ref design fray. But I mean, there are really important lessons there, as there are for other systems worldwide. But from our perspective, it's just great to have this chance to hear from you. And thank you everyone who's joined the questions. As I said at the beginning, there is going to be a monthly seminar in this series. Those of you who are old enough to remember the dot-com boom will recall the organisation First Tuesday, which used to have these sessions every Tuesday of the month. We've gone for a third Thursday slot for meta research. So there's going to be a series, and the next one is in July. We have Ismail Raffles, a colleague of Sarah's from CWTS at Leiden, who's going to be talking about priority setting in mental health research. Some really interesting work he's doing on the sort of politics of upstream priority setting in research. and he's going to be joined by Søren Nastrom from Vinnova, Sweden's national funder for innovation. And then later in the series, we have in September, Cameron Nayland from Perth, Curtin University, big activist and thinker on open research and infrastructures for openness in research. In October, we have Joy Zhang and her co-author of a really interesting new book on China, India, and the decolonization of global governance in research. And then in November, we have Kristen Smith, who is one of the founder and one of the forces behind the Cite Black Women Collective and the move for more citational justice in the US and elsewhere. So that's a bit of what's coming in the series, but this has been a great start. Thank you again, JP, and thank you all, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.